Hi, this video is in response to a guy trashing my videos. His name is Logicked, and he responded to my video called God Answers. It was based on my Dormanian argument for God. His video in response was called Another Proof of God Poorly Done. So what I want to do here is address his questions as well as clarify what I meant in my video that he misconceived. To make it short, my argument in that video that he responded to was basically like, if there wasn't a God, we wouldn't have the ability to think. So you might have heard like Descartes, the philosopher. He said, "I think, therefore I am." What I'm essentially saying is, there is thought, therefore there is a God. And the reason why the brain doesn't suffice as an answer for that question, or that in that regard, is that to survive, a thing has to make distinctions. To make distinctions, a thing has to know how to negate, and to make and after all, because distinctions are this as opposed to that, this or the other, this not that. So negations are conceptual. I think Logicked had a problem with that in his video. But think about it. Voids. There are no voids in the actual universe. This is what's it called? Cosmology. There are no voids in the actual universe. There's only low energy spaces. So there are no voids to directly perceive or directly perceive or observe. Next, absences are just the lack of something fulfilling that which exists. So that's based on relations between that and one thing as opposed to another. And that, after all, is conceptual. I think you would agree with that. Someone might counter argue and say, well, I can see a whole, therefore I can see absence directly perceivable. I would disagree, because for something that doesn't conceptualize, that whole would just appear to be part of the landscape. It would just walk into the hole, out of it, and traverse onward. That wouldn't really count. It would just be perceived as an is. It's just not as something to be filled in, as an absence. And I think you would agree with me that relations are conceptual. For instance, you can't see a thing and its absence at the same time and in the same respect. That would violate the law of non-contradiction. In other words, you can't directly perceive of that and the other at the same time. You have to form that relationship. The problem here is that the first forms of life could not. They didn't have brains or central nervous systems. So, and after all, I am talking about the first forms of life. I think, Logic, you were confused a little bit. You thought I was talking about how human understanding evolved, but actually I'm always talking about the first forms of life. I want to start from the beginning. And it's, you have to be careful not to presuppose when you listen to an argument. Just listen to the actual words. That's my best advice. So that's a problem, because in regards to evolution, well, the question then is, with evolution, is how, not so much how did it survive, but how did it know to perceive. Wait, how did it have the ability to perceive that there was more than one thing to choose from? Generally, that's the question to ask. Because for an entirely ignorant thing, it would just see everything as one indistinguishable blob, I would imagine. Because it wouldn't have the resources to make distinctions. That's my whole point. Now, I think, so that's my question, but you liken that to asking a computer. I don't have my computer with me, but if I did, I would ask it. Asking a computer, how did it learn Boolean logic? That's what you compared it to. But what you're ignoring here is that computers are, after all, pre-programmed. So I think you're missing the point a little bit, unless you feel that this ability to make distinctions is programmed somehow. And also, that has to do with your dominoes example too. Dominoes fall randomly based on how they were constructed on, say, a table or something like that. These things don't make distinctions. The first forms of life, on the other hand, such as bacteria, do make distinctions, and we find that today. bacteria, they do respond to external stimuli. They detect the environment around them. In fact, they respond to specific molecules. For instance, they swim towards high concentrations of things they're attracted to and away from high concentrations of things that repel them, that are harmful to them. And this is especially relevant when you consider how much of the earth is repellent to bacteria. For instance, 97.5% of the earth is salt water. So now that's salt happens to be a repellent to bacteria. Bacteria can't handle salt. It either kills them or paralyzes them. And 71% of the earth, after all, is water. So most of the earth is repellent to bacteria. In fact, even fresh water has concentrations of pH, such as sodium ions and chloride ions. So these are things they would have to stay away from. Now, you might say that this ability emerged, perhaps. Maybe that might be your next recourse. And this seems to be the paradigm that science is moving towards nowadays, that consciousness, at least, emerged. But a philosopher by the name of Galen Strawson brought up an interesting point here, that things that emerge seem to have the properties already potentially in the things that these things arise from, such as water. Its components already consist of the property of liquidity. After all, we're talking about gases here. Likewise, with color, another property said to emerge, these components already have the property of white light, as you can see in the spectrum. So the consciousness also, its components must have had the properties of awareness for it to have emerged from. And actually, a famous neuroscientist these days, Antonio Damasio, actually shares this sentiment. I'm going to put the link in my video column about this video that I've seen on YouTube. It's basically the last 5 minutes of it. He responds, let's say, to animists in the audience by the name of William Irwin Thompson, who says that perhaps science could do better should we just presuppose that everything's alive to some degree. Damasio answers accordingly, quote, I'm firmly convinced that bacteria, for example, and groups of bacteria behave socially, have a very complex life, and have something that is the beginning of sentience. But whether I'm ready to give them the passport to mind is another story. You might agree with that latter part, Logicked. There is sensitivity, in fact, and that is the bridge to our sentience. But the direct sensation is not there as there is in our mind. What is there is a series of elements as prompting a series of behaviors that are already installed in the machine, and the machine then behaves accordingly given certain circumstances. But it's a very minimal but here's a very important but it's a very minimal difference, actually. It's both very important in the way one talks about it, but I think in the end we're all on the same continuum. That's an important point I'm trying to make. It's just that where I put the border, Damasio says, I sort of come down all the way to the border, but I'm not ready to go the last stretch because I don't think the mind is there. But there is the continuity, but, once again, an important but there is the continuity, and the reason why we have a mind is that there are these creatures with all this standard equipment in their organisms. Now, the reason why I believe that Damasio doesn't want to go all the way, or doesn't go all the way, the last stretch, is that if you read his book, Self Comes to Mind, you will notice that he equates consciousness with a sense of self, and he doesn't really explain why he came to that conclusion, other than that he took it from a philosopher called John Searle, who he happens to respect. But I would ask either one of them, like, what about a selfless monk, for instance? Are they someone that has no self-identity? Would that person not be conscious? In my view, the only thing that's could not be conscious is something totally lacking awareness. However, you seem to think that, Logic, I'm referring to you now, you seem to think that distinctions are somehow conceptual and physical. I would agree to the extent that that anything physical would have conceptual dimensions. This is similar to how philosopher Aristotle would conjoin matter and void, for instance. So as to your question, quote, am I saying is not stone exist and are merely traits we assign to things? The answer is pretty much no. Essentially, in my view, the abstract and the physical are one and the same. Pure voids don't exist, and rather voids exist only to the extent that their physical counterparts exist. To suggest otherwise really makes one a dualist on some level, and I'm not. In fact, anything transcendent, there's nothing transcendental about my argument. Someone once called it, my argument, a tag argument, a transcendental argument for God, but there's really nothing transcendent about it. But for you, Logicked, you seem to, and actually you do say this, that the concept of negation is different than the reality of negation, and that puts you on the par with a theist who might think that body and soul are two separate things, for instance, which is something that you should consider as a consequence to your views. Essentially, it's my view that life is ingrained in the very fabric of the universe. And, for instance, it's a mental universe. This is a phrase that a physicist came up with to describe the universe, Richard Kahn Henry. And this is this basically follows what contemporary philosopher Thomas Nagel claimed, quote, physical objects alone cannot account for subjectivity. Their constituents must have subjective features themselves, but those constituents are no different than those making up the rest of the universe. This is also consistent with the theory in contemporary science. You might have heard of it. It's the Conway's free will theorem, and it goes something like, quote, if we have a free will in the sense that our choices are not a function of the past, then subject to certain assumptions, so must some elementary particles likewise have free will. Generally, I believe minds emerge from energy in the same manner and in the same instance that energy emerged from mind. So as to your other question, is it true about reality that there isn't a teapot revolving around the sun? I believe you're asking, does such a teapot not exist, and wouldn't such a non-existence be real, or does it exist as a non-existent? Now, ironically, Bertrand Russell came up with this whole teapot argument. He actually came up with a means to refer to such non-entities without taking a stance as to their existence. That's with this theory of forms. But I have to agree that this teapot does not exist. Not in itself, at least. Not especially in regards to a cosmic teapot, which is how Bertrand Russell described or framed his argument. That's because there's no physical component to pair it up with. It has no vantage point in the universe. So you might have missed the fact, or maybe it was just implied, that I actually think that God has physical components, or a physical dimension at least. In fact, in a future video of mine, I do intend to show how even a scientific proof of God can be set up. It's my view essentially that God would exist as an abstract counterpart to the universe itself, and essentially the universe's vantage point in all of its entirety. This is simply bringing the idea of panpsychism to its physically attainable logical conclusion, especially if we regard a symmetrical universe. I don't know if you know this, but symmetry is basically a default assumption, really, when it comes to positing a scientific theory. That's always the first thing to assume, that we live in a symmetrical universe. And so if symmetry is such a natural expectation, it would follow then that nature itself would have such a symmetrical balance. Otherwise, reality itself would be an anomaly. So, and that would basically be the ultimate abstraction. As I said earlier, awareness is the most basic level of thought, and the highest level of thought would be everything fully comprising of all things epistemic, knowledge, morality, and the ability to so conceive, I guess. And in other words, all knowing, all good, and all powerful, which is God. Okay, I'll wrap it up with that. I just want to add a footnote here to any theists watching, what they might be wondering what I think about body and soul. Well, I do believe that soul, for me, soul and mind are the same thing. I do believe that the mind will continue after the body's demise. And the reason why is this is basically following the law of conservation. If the physical persists in some degree, so must the abstract. So to be consistent, I would say that I believe in some kind of reincarnation. I'll leave it at that. But to wrap up, I would say that whatever life one lived would determine what kind of, essentially how one would persist in the future of their being after their body's demise. And so shall that be. Well, I'll leave it at that now, and I thank you for listening. Thank you, Logic, for considering my views, and I hope this clears things up. And I'll look forward to hearing from you, perhaps, or not. But thank you, anyways. Have a nice day, everyone, or have a nice night. As you can see, it's pretty dark. All right, thank you. All right, bye-bye.